7th, 1945. A Toronto Star headline read as follows: "Unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over." For the 75th anniversary of VE Day, we have invited James Thompson to take us back to the Canadian experience of that moment in history. We are so pleased to have James with us today. James is a truly passionate explorer of history, politics, and world culture with lifelong learners. He studied history and art history in Canada and Britain. An adult education teacher since 2006, James teaches through adult education centers and retirement homes around the GTA. He's an active promoter of Toronto museums and a friend of the schoolhouse. So James, I hand it to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. I really appreciate that. And I should point out that it's nice to be back. It was under very different circumstances last year, as you may remember, when I was with everybody actually in the physical space of the schoolhouse talking about the 200th anniversary of the significance of Queen Victoria. And so for this year, it's good to be back to be remembering VE Day. And if everybody can see on the top of the screen, I have a series of random photos taken from the City of Toronto archives in most cases, where we have the events of May 7th, May 8th, 1945. Starting on the far left, that hopefully is a familiar landmark to you. Then the famous photo, which I'll get into, the famous photo in the middle, and then this one not very far from this, again from the first one, which is the clock tower of what we call the Old City Hall, a rare moment of Toronto, old Toronto, loosening up under those occasions. And then finally, which we'll get to, is you have photo of the King and the Queen, a very unusual photo because, as you may know, the King and the Queen are always apolitical, but as things were as unusual as to have a cop in Toronto going wild, this is the closest the royal family would go wild to having the Prime Minister, a politically appointed figure, voted in, sharing the moment on the balcony with them. But really, the events of May 7th, 8th, 1945 were very special. So let me now start by taking you back. Let's see what. There we go. The grim outlook of exactly 80 years ago. Well, why? Obviously, VE Day was incredibly significant. Not only was it a celebration 5 years after the beginning of the war, really, it was also an incredible sense of relief. And it was a very dire situation in 1940, very different from 1945. And this is a photo of the grim outlook of exactly 80 years ago on Friday, September the 13th, 1940. Buckingham Palace was hit in the Blitz. And that was the famous remark of the Queen Mother to say, or Queen Elizabeth to say, "I'm glad we've been hit, we've been bombed, now I can look the East End in the face." This was the time of the real threat of invasion. And so that's what, that was 2 days ago. So we're up to the height, really, of the great grimness of the whole war of exactly 80 years ago right around now. Similarly, 80 years ago today, on September the 15th, 1940, was the 13 hours that saved Britain. Hitler and Goering had decided that if the invasion was going to take place, there had to be a final showdown where the RAF had to be liquidated by the German Luftwaffe. So there you were, a match battle of roughly 3,000 Heinkel bombers coming in to engage with roughly 700 Spitfires. And what we have here is the plotting table where on that day, 80 years ago today, at number 11 Fighter Group Operations Room, RAF stationed in Uxbridge, in England, obviously just outside of London, the plotters noticed a huge buildup, indicating that the Germans were coming in large formations, never seen. And really, the message was sent to Churchill that this could be the invasion by a bombing attack that had been maybe kept up the sleeve. And Air Marshal Keith Park said they're definitely up to something. And they were. The bombers kept coming in again and again and again. The RAF went up 3-4 times with the Spitfires to engage. But it wasn't as decisive as they thought. But it was nearly everybody, and this is known as Battle of Britain Day today in Britain. The idea was that the RAF was definitely pushed to the limit. And so when I was in London for the 50th VE Day at 50, which I witnessed myself, I obviously wasn't alive when this all happened, but I got a real sense of what it must have been like. They had the Queen Mother, who was then had problems with her vision because of cataracts and a bad hip, was determined in the spirit of the war to come out to Hyde Park to open the celebrations, if you want to call it that, at 11:30. I was there. I saw her speak. I remember that pale blue hat. And she said, "This day will bring back many memories to many people. I do hope that all those who go to the many ceremonies arranged will remember with pride and gratitude those men and women, armed and unarmed, whose courage really helped to bring us to victory." And the way she said that, she memorized it, the way she said it, you got a sense from the tone of her voice that this really was a close call, that there was no guarantee that the Allied forces would win. And so therefore, when they did, getting back to my original point, VE Day is a celebration, but it's also a relief. And that was abundantly clear, the way she spoke. So that was then. There we go. This was the interesting thing that was in the news. There was an incredible lead up to this 50th anniversary celebration. And the big thing was politics as usual. Who attends the 1995 50th anniversary of VE Day over that weekend? And what happened was the British military wanted to have, with Canadians included and Americans included, they wanted to try to recreate the Victory Parade of 1945. But the government of John Major stepped in and being a little bit more, well, government being bureaucratic, and he said that won't really go. So what happened was he invited Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and the Germans had an idea. They wanted to be in a parade. They wanted to march down Whitehall with the Allied forces to put a different spin on it, to celebrate 50 years of peace. Well, that wasn't going to work. John Major told Kohl that that's not really going to work because this is because of what it was and what it is. So Kohl showed up, but the Germans were not allowed to participate in the event, and so there were no parades. But taking a bow for a generation on May the 8th, 1995, I saw this myself as a symbol of the then and now. You had the 3 surviving people within Britain, as I saw them. I was over there studying as a student, and this is what I saw. And for the thousands of people out cheering, this was a moment of remembrance and a moment to celebrate a great relief. So going back, why it was all so important, and this is where I can offer a personal addition to this. Joan Venables was a Wren, which was known as the Wrens was British originally, but she was in the Canadian part of it, the Royal Canadian Naval Service Unit. And they had only been got up in Canada since 1942. She joined in 1943. And what the Wrens did was that they were not, maybe you've heard of them, maybe you know people who are actually in the Wrens. She never was in a combating situation. I don't think they were, but her job was to sit in a radar detection hut or a communique detection hut. It was called direction finding in Gloucester, just outside of Ottawa. And the events of May the 7th were coinciding, ironically enough, with her 20th birthday. And what she did was, this is one of the photos I found that she kept. She said it was a fascinating but grueling experience all at the same time. That's Joan's handwriting. Direction finding, Gloucester, 12 miles from Ottawa, 1944. Well, she was there for the last 2 years of the war, and her job was to track, using technology, she'd be fascinated by this technology of Zoom, but to track the signals between Wilhelmshaven, where the U-boat headquarters were, and the orders being sent out to all the U-boats. And she said sometimes it was lonely on the watch at different hours of the night, but sometimes she had to put her headphones down because the ticking was so loud that the submarines were so incredibly close. And of course, the great urban myth is that apparently one U-boat got as far as almost Wolfe Island, within 20 kilometers of Kingston. This was in 42. The story is Wilbert Wall of Clayton, New York, saw the thing actually dive bombed by US defense coming across the river and bombing it into oblivion, which would mean then that there would be a submarine at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River at near Wolfe Island. Maybe it's a little bit of a Loch Ness Monster story, but nonetheless, there is ample evidence from what people have said that the U-boats were recorded as being seen this far down the St. Lawrence River. And at a national memorial, not memorial, but a national landmark like this, that's quite serious. So that was why her work was really incredibly valuable, tracking these submarines that were coming into the estuary, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, getting into the St. Lawrence River. And then the news, which was memorable. And it's amazing, as she always said, what a little high school German can do for you in a pinch. Because on May the 7th, she told this story many times, and that's a picture of the hut in the winter, or the facilities in the winter, when it looked at its most desolate. And this is Gloucester, which is now, of course, part of Ottawa. But anyway, on May the 7th, she said she wanted a little break, and she switched her frequency off tracking submarines to listening to her favorite musician of the time, which was Frank Sinatra. And then after her break from listening to Frank Sinatra, she switched back to her job, getting back onto the frequency, but something had changed. The message, the code which she had been given, because presumably we had broken the code a couple of years ago and they never changed it, the message was now what we call en clair in German. And if you could understand the basic German, you'd get the idea of the message. The message came from Grand Admiral Dönitz himself, and that was signed Dönitz. Now, she may have known this, but Dönitz was now not only the head of, this is what's confusing, he was the head of the German Navy, but because there were so many disasters in the collapse of the government with Hitler going down, he was therefore made the head of government, the president. So he was sending out a message in his capacity as the head of the German government and head of the Navy to simply tell all of the submarines, as my mother always told the story, to surface, fly not the white, but fly a black flag and head for the nearest port. And so all the chickens, as it were, came home to roost. And U-boats were coming in to the nearest Allied port on May the 7th, 1945, all the way through to the end of June. They were coming in the droves. And this is one that was photographed that came into the harbor in St. John's, Newfoundland around this time in 1945. So what an incredible sense of relief is what my mother said. She was the first in her unit to hear them and be able to confirm by understanding German the message that the war was over. She threw her headphones down and ran out of her hut and went running down the road off to the barrack, where maybe a lot of her colleagues were on their breaks or whatever, just simply saying, we have no more work to do. The war is over. And so that was one local reaction. But on a grand scale, Churchill was the one that coined the phrase VE Day in his May the 8th broadcast. Now, the speech, which you can hear on YouTube, I heard it myself. It was replayed at exactly the same time, 50 years to the day, at 3 p.m. in London, May the 8th, 95, on BBC Radio 2. And this is it. It was a very lackluster speech. It doesn't have any of that Churchillian oomph to it, that and drama and wordsmithing. But by then, his role had really changed. He was no longer a morale or rally booster. He was now simply saying the war was over. And he simply said, yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. So there you are. Churchill even had a sense of living and making history when he gave out those specific instructions. Then he closes by saying, today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow, which would be May the 9th, will also be Victory in Europe Day. Now, for people in the military like my father, who was stationed in Holland, the surrender was happening in bits and pieces. On May the 4th, Lunenburg Heath in northern Germany near Hamburg was a major surrender to Monty. Bernard Montgomery was happened to be in that quadrant of Germany at that time and took a surrender of the military. But what's significant and why Churchill is able to announce when he did was, remember, Grand Admiral Dönitz is not only Navy, but he's also the head of the state, and then Alfred Jodl represented the military. So you had a combination of military and political coming together to sign. And when that happened, 1 + 1 equals unconditional surrender. And so it had happened on May the 7th, as you said, Lynn, in your comments, but it went public a day later, and that's where we get VE Day on May the 8th. Well, Canadian soldiers were lucky if they were stationed in London, and they would have probably been nearly hit by the flying bombs, the doodle bugs a couple of months earlier. But those who were fortunate enough to be stationed in London were in time for a big party, which really ripped loose on May the 8th. And then as a result, we have to back home. The word got out quickly. Toronto's orderly order in council planning a VE Day celebration here, when, not if. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at this, it says a civic service of praise and thanksgiving to Almighty God will be held when victory is achieved in the present European conflict. So they knew it was going to take place at 12:30, but the day was really not confirmed until the very, very end, or not very end, but very, very suddenly. And so I think that probably the city printed this as soon as it was announced to the world on April the 30th 1945, that Hitler had killed himself, committed suicide in the Berlin bunker. And so the beginning, it was inevitable that the war would wind down soon after. And so what happened was there would be fireworks, speeches, food at what they call community centers, but they're really they're really public parks. And I'm going to read you, this is the back of it. It gives all the city councilors, and it gives you like stations, all the parks. And one of them down here is called, what's it called? Willowvale Park. It's very small, the print, if you can see it. Willowvale Park is now Christie Pitts. So all the parks, that is to say, that they mention here are still very much with us. And I'm going to read you the transcription of what the information says. Arrangements have been made to hold community services, demonstrations, and celebration programs in each of the under-mentioned parks. Ample opportunity will be provided in each of the said parks for an organized celebration with bands, community singing, and display of fireworks, in which all classes of citizens may participate. That's what it says. Tune in to local radio stations for further details, particularly on VE Day. Participate in the service and celebration in the park nearest your respective locality. Refrain from driving vehicles into the downtown area and do not create pedestrian congestion in this district. Remove all non-essential vehicles from the streets. Remember, victory in Europe is not final victory. And I'll agree with that because I'll pick that point up later. So a lot of people, unlike the situation today, would have been crammed into TTC vehicle streetcars because if you remember the severe gas and petrol rationing and no automobiles being made in wartime, there were very few cars and people were not encouraged to drive. But like today, a lot of people opted to ride around and get around town on bicycles for the same reasons that we find ourselves in today. And so the happy return of private parties with no social distancing, I think this was from May the 7th. This is from the city archives. A bonfire on Clinton Street where these good people had decided to take it onto themselves to have a neighborhood party. I would think this was probably around close to midnight on May the 7th, getting into May the 8th, which would have been the real day of celebration. And the epicenter of Toronto's celebration was the City Hall, May 7th or 8th, 1945. We now call this the Old City Hall. But nonetheless, it was where everybody seemed to be really gravitating towards. Because it seems to be, in all these photos, it seems to really sort of turn up as such. This is, of course, Bay Street on May the 8th, 1945. And this is actually taken by a Toronto photographer. The city of Toronto wanted this to be recorded. And the photographer appointed by the city's name was, maybe you've heard of him, his name was Ronnie Jakes. And on the clock tower in the background, it reads, Toronto's objective, 250 millions. Now, I think what that is a lot of cities, and it gives you a sense of the town civic pride attitude in Toronto at the time, that a lot of civilians were meant to find out ways to raise money for the war effort. And so what that is I believe that is a thermometer showing how much we've raised, which is a very interesting point. So that obviously indicates that this is really a communal effort, not government doing the whole thing. And so there's this sense of civic pride going on. Well, there's the famous photo. The revelers on Bay Street of May the 8th, 1945. I would say this photo is really our iconic Toronto's photo of the day the war ended. Of course, we chose it for the promotion for this. We have the revelers on Bay Street, and it really proves that if this is also the work of Ronnie Jakes, that all the action or the activity was within the few blocks of what we call now Old City Hall. And so we have Bay Street, Queen Street, Yonge Street was essentially where this was all happening. Then the Canadian enthusiasm on Bay Street, much of the reveling was on Yonge, and as I said, at Queen and on Bay. This is also from May the 8th, 1945. It shows you how great minds think alike. This, of course, is a very relaxed scene, but it would be, I don't know if this went around the world or just was known in Toronto only, but it would have been no doubt supplanted by this more famous one, from which you may have seen by the American photographer Alfred Eisenstadt, VJ Day in Times Square. And for the Americans, I guess for really everybody, the war was really over when Japan surrendered in August. And so again, you have this sense of romance, this sense of the spontaneous, the sense that, again, this sense of relief that people are just temporarily just doing whatever the hell they want to do. And you got that sense in Toronto, which was a smaller, more rigid town, at least in those days, if you compare this one. Again, I'm sure this is incredibly spontaneous. When you look at the laughter on the lady's face and how the paper was sort of, again, wanting to get into the spirit of the moment and sensing maybe this is a photo for posterity to remind people of what we were looking at 80 years or 75 years later, she throws up the paper to remind us what all the excitement is about. So it's spontaneous, I think, but very clever and a good historical record, and well worth its spot in the City of Toronto archives. So again, great minds think alike. That was the Toronto version on VE Day. This is the famous one, VJ Day, when, of course, a lot of people in the States think that World War II was only from the Japanese War. So for a lot of people, World War II only went from 41 to 45, whereas they say 1 to 5, rather than 1939 to 1945. This is a fascinating photo again, signs of a loosening in Toronto, a rare moment. This is Constable Harry Carroll at VE celebrations, looking north on Bay Street towards City Hall. Again, all these photos seem to be pretty tight. The same day and more or less the same location. And I think this was also Ronnie Jakes. And so it did finally take place. Again, all the information, the pre-hype that there would be a solemn service at the cenotaph, and there certainly was. Mayor Robert Saunders, not the Premier of Ontario, but look at all those people gathering there. That's quite a big crowd. And I couldn't find any reference to anything going on in Queen's Park. It seemed to be Toronto's cenotaph, which was opened, I should point out, in 1939 by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. This is where the congregate setting, to use that term that we hear so much these days, or was the point where dignitaries are formally introduced to the City of Toronto. And so the King and Queen were here in 1939, in May the 22nd. And so now, on May the 8th, 1945, everything goes into high gear to not only celebrate, but to realize again this sense of relief that we had won, we had survived, we had not been invaded. And Mayor Saunders, Robert Saunders, was there to lay a wreath to all of those who had technically been killed up until a day before. So this was, again, one for the record books about what May the 8th, 1945 meant for Toronto. But a different celebration or a different situation in other parts of the country. From celebration to riot, Halifax had a slightly different reaction. Really what it comes down to is disorganized or poor planning. The result of their celebration was 200 arrested, 700 shops looted and damaged, and the catalyst was burning this tram car in protest because, as I said, gasoline is rationed. People in wartime in cities were not encouraged to use private cars, either trams or bicycles, to save fuel. And so what had happened in this situation was tension had been mounting between the servicemen and the Navy personnel who had been basically taken over the city of Halifax for the duration of the war. Halifax was one of the most important port cities for the Allies during the whole war. And to avoid damage and everybody going wild, the city administration had decided that all bars, restaurants would be shut down. Well, we know what that's like. Essentially, Halifax was to go into lockdown to dissuade Navy and military personnel from celebrating and taking over the downtown core. So everything was really buttoned down. And this led to a protest amongst the armed services who felt they'd done a pretty good job and felt rather entitled to take over the city for at least a day, demanded a loosening of everything up. And so while the city government took a defensive posture, the military allowed servicemen to go out of their military installations, go into town, and that was when the mistake was made, when the conflict really blew. And so by midnight of May the 7th, 12,000 military personnel, on the say-so of their commanding officer giving them a furlough, hit the central core of the downtown area in a very celebratory mood, but were furious that everything was locked up in a lockdown. So as a result, this tram car was burned and mayhem ensued as protest, rage, and relief at the same time. And so that heady brew and strange combination of relief and, oh well, nothing is important anymore, spilled over into disrespect of a military, Navy-based mainly, going off duty. And from standing on guard, they went to the other extreme. So from what my research was, the damage to the retail and to the shops and the restaurants, and there was over $1 million worth of shattered glass from restaurants, cars, trams that had to be repaired. The total bill to repair the downtown core of Halifax was about $5 million in 1945 money. And so there's the great deliverance, as King George VI said back in London. On May the 8th, the King and Queen appeared 8 times on the famous balcony. Buckingham Palace was really where the Londoners went in relation to where they came here, of course, as I said, which was Queen and Bay. And as I said earlier, this was a rare occasion that the royal family would delve into politics and side with a political leader. But because the times being so special, the Prime Minister came out on the balcony, one of his greatest moments. And I have a feeling that based on the way they're positioned here in this photo that we looked at the beginning from '95, I'm sure the Queen, Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret had seen this photo and were perhaps placing themselves to recreate it, knowing how important this photo is in terms of significance. This was taken probably about 4 o'clock, 4:30 after Churchill's announcement. He would have ridden in a car to the palace. So we're up to about late afternoon on May the 8th. And then early evening was Churchill's greatest moment of triumph, where he stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health offices in Whitehall with his number 2. This is probably Clement Attlee, the Labour Party leader, who was his deputy chair in the middle of the war. And Attlee, of course, would succeed Churchill 2 months later in a devastating loss at the polls, where Churchill would lose an election in July the 25th, 1945, and Attlee would succeed him. But this was his basking moment. And yes, Churchill looks to be the man or the person of the hour, but he didn't think of that himself entirely from what we know of comments he made to the inner circle of his staff. He felt a little bit languorous or remorseful or with regret. He had hoped to share this moment with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it had been planned that as long ago as the middle of April, that when the war ended, Roosevelt would be in London a few days before the surrender, when it was going to come, and Roosevelt would have appeared in London side by side, somehow, given his disability, with Churchill. But it was not to be. And so we do know from what he said that Churchill at that moment said, in his own mind, yes, I can flash the victory sign, V for victory sign, but I can't take all the credit for this. My number 1 buddy, so to speak, I wish he was here. So that was his greatest moment. But the big question is, did victory in May 1945 mean peace in Europe? Well, not entirely. The answer to that is the peace would be relatively short-lived. Winston Churchill, thrown out of office just 2 months later, was basically out of a job a year later. And the new president who succeeded Roosevelt, Harry Truman, invited Churchill as a private citizen to come to his home state of Missouri, to Fulton, to appropriate place for an English prime minister, Westminster College, to speak. And as a citizen, Churchill basically unrolled and unburdened his worries of the future. And you may have known this. This was the famous speech where he brought in not the word VE Day, but he introduced the term the Iron Curtain when he spoke. And he said, an iron curtain is descending across Eastern Europe, where so many countries, Latvia, Poland, etc., were now under the yoke of Joseph Stalin, not freed, as he had hoped, entirely from the rankles of Hitler. So he was very concerned, Churchill, that Stalin could not be trusted and that this could be another Hitler waiting in the wings. And one of the reasons Churchill looked at these personalities, and he was always interested in the personalities of his allies, like Roosevelt, and his foes alike, was because he had an incredible sense of history. He wrote history, and Churchill was very proud of the fact that his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, defeated an army of Louis XIV at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. And so Churchill wrote and said to people, when asked about where the world was going after VE Day, he said, at least as far as Europe is concerned, the decline of Spain, as we have seen, as history has showed us, meant the rise of France. And so the fall of one leads to the buildup of another superpower following very quickly on the heels of the one that has gone down. And here we have Charles II of Spain, dies around 1700 with no heir. Louis XIV is very quick to move into Spain and put onto the throne to maintain the power base in Europe, a Bourbon to replace a Habsburg on the throne of Spain. And of course, where Churchill knows all of this is because it was during this conflict of the War of the Spanish Succession, to stop France from very quickly becoming the successor to Spain. Battles were waged to curb the sudden growth of power of Louis XIV in France, German states, Belgium, the Habsburg dominions in, as I said, Belgium, the Holland area. One went down in terms of influence, another was greedily trying to replace very quickly. And so with that historical perspective on things, coming out of his own family, he couldn't help but see the Hitler-Stalin, not balance of power, but the Hitler-Stalin power base as being a rehash of what had happened in the 18th century. And so as a way to close, I guess you could say to conclude is that Churchill therefore knew he was making history as well as living it when he declared on May the 8th, this is Victory in Europe Day. He had a sense of history. He had a sense of importance. He was living it as much as making it. But nonetheless, his sense of nailing it and saying, this is VE Day, and all that Britain and the Allies had fought and risked coming so close to a disaster. That is why, for so many reasons, VE Day is important to remember 75 years later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. I think we can imagine us all sending you virtual applause. I just at this time want to remind everyone that James can take questions. So I will be watching the chat function. It'll be in the bottom of your screen.
Oh my, yeah.
So give everyone a minute to submit your questions if you'd like. You're seeing them as well, James?
Yeah, there's one so far.
So we'll read out this one for now, but if you think of any questions, please feel free to continue submitting them. Lynn requests, James, please tell us more about Joan.
Well, Joan Venables, or Joan Thompson, was my mother. She died in 2014 at the age of 88 in a retirement home in the city. She was attending every Remembrance Day service. She had a very interesting upbringing. Her father said to her, don't spread yourself out. Be dedicated and stick with one organization and contribute to something. And so in her later years, she was a long serving volunteer at the Royal Ontario Museum. And that dovetailed her experiences in the Navy. She was never in any other military organization other than the Wrens. And she really learned a lot from that experience. She said it was, as she would say, hard going sometimes. She said in the winter, it was so cold in that barrack hut that you saw that the cloths that they would leave out sometimes got froze almost. And she had a brother who was in the Royal Navy, and her father, who was an English immigrant, did his part in the Second World War by founding a home guard after the Battle of Dunkirk, which put shockwaves through everybody to realize we've got to wake up and do something and take this seriously. He in Canada set up the home guard with others. He went down, my mother said, to drill at the Moss Park Armories 2 nights a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, because he was by then too old to fight. But he really wanted to do something and felt the sense of urgency. At that point, my uncle went into the Royal Navy and went overseas and was not seen for 5 years. And my mother was dispatched to go into the Wrens to do the basic training and then to go to, by 43, when she was graduate, she just finished high school and she got out of high school, graduated in 43 at 18, and she stayed there until the end of the war.
So next question, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
In the next 20 years, we will lose our last World War II veteran. How can Canada ensure that we keep the memories of this part of our history alive when the voices of that generation is gone?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I can give you an answer from what one veteran who was taken prisoner at Hong Kong, George McDonald, told me all of this. I had this conversation 2 or 3 years ago. You may be interested. George McDonald was in the Pacific War. He was with the Royal Rifles and taken prisoner and was held in Japan from 1941 until 45. So he had a very interesting, he said, sometimes it was pleasant, not very often. It was a struggle. Sometimes it was revealing about human nature. Not quite like Unbroken, if you've seen that movie, but not far off, because like in that situation, he did in his lifetime meet some of the people who were on the other side all those years ago. To answer your question, George McDonald said the way we can, and he's the only one left of the Royal Rifles at 95. He said the only way this can work is for students to make importance of what is Remembrance Day, work in their local, go to their local archives or libraries, read up on what veterans have said, find lots of recordings online in YouTube of veterans events, veterans speaking, and it's up to kids in the schools to really absorb all this knowledge by, like I've done in a sense today, preparing presentations to talk about it in detail. And we both agreed in this more or less parallel conversation of a few years ago that the best way to do this is to continue to make importance out of Remembrance Day, because that's what it was all about. You know, at the end of World War I in the 20s, the streetcar drivers would stop their streetcar. Some of them used to stand out on the street for a minute. So that's how I think it could be addressed. And there's certainly, it can be done. We're all busy, yes, but I think Remembrance Day could be, think of that archival photo I showed you of everybody on May the 8th in Toronto, down at the Cenotaph. That could continue Remembrance Day to be the focal point, and we could get kids to do assignments. What George McDonald has been doing has been going around to the schools in person, but that can't be sustainable forever. So now it would be the kids using so much that's been put online and through the Dominion Institute, these history project groups that are available, and for kids to be able to cull the information and maybe put a new interesting spin on it. Because of course, with kids, hey, it's going to be old for a lot of people, but it's going to be very new for them. And so I think that freshness will be welcome down the road. Okay, let's see, any more questions?
I don't see any more questions currently, but perhaps we'll wait a minute to see if anyone
Okay.
like to type
Well,
anything
thank you.
in.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for that. Just watching here. Yep.
I have a quick question for you, James. Is
Yeah.
there kind of recordings or resources, just kind of thinking about what you were saying about educating students? Are there any veteran interviews or any kind of resources you used in particular to talk about this history?
Yes. Rudyard Griffiths was the head of the Dominion Institute, and the Dominion Institute was a veterans tapestry network of veterans, and they have classroom materials and resource materials. But in terms of online, I mean, YouTube is where everybody seems to be congregating these days, but the Dominion Institute was really set up. And if you go online and type in Veterans Memories, the Dominion Institute, you would get a real sense from there of what they have put together in terms of resources. And I mean, some of these resources are going to be 5, 6, maybe 10 years old, but nonetheless, they would have been built with the input of veterans while they were still alive. And believe me, people like George McDonald, and who's written a book called One Soldier's Story, published by Dundurn Press about 2005. Oh yeah, the memory, thank you, from Jeremy, the Memory Project, yes. www.thememoryproject.com. Many energetic seniors or veterans/seniors who were coming back to this, particularly as they grew older towards the end of their life, really pushed with the energy that they had to get involved with things like the Memory Project and the Dominion Institute, and to help create these projects while they still could, or these, I shouldn't say projects, resources within a broad umbrella of being called a project. So the one you really probably want is thememoryproject.com.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jeremy.
Okay, well, it looks like that's it for our questions. So we'll conclude our special lecture this evening. Thank you so much again, James, for agreeing to participate in this, what you would consider our inaugural Zoom event. And thank you very much to everyone who's been listening in as well. We really appreciate your continued support in these times of change. Always feel free to stay in touch with us. We do have a website, enochturnerschoolhouse.ca. Or if you have any questions following this session, or if you think of anything you want to ask James, always feel free to email us at info@enochturnerschoolhouse.ca. That's info@enochturnerschoolhouse.ca. And we can always get the answers for you, or if you're interested in even joining our mailing list, we're hoping to have similar events in the future to keep in touch with everyone. So thank you again, and thank you so much, James, for your special lecture. And have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Just sign it over. Sorry.